Martha sat in the dimly lit room, her hands resting on the edge of an old wooden table. The faint scent of lavender from a vase of wilting flowers mixed with the crisp coolness of autumn air drifting through the open window. This had been her sanctuary for over 40 years, a place where she and James, her late husband, had built a life filled with shared dreams and quiet joys. Now it was silent, the echoes of laughter replaced by the ticking of a clock that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. Her children, once the center of her world, had long left the nest to pursue their own lives in the bustling city. She had raised them with every ounce of love she possessed, sacrificing her own desires so they could have the opportunities she and James could only dream of. Yet, as she sat there now, the harsh truth of her solitude pressed against her like a heavy stone. When James passed away unexpectedly in a car accident, Martha had clung to the hope that her children would fill the void left in her heart. David, her eldest, was the first to insist she come live with him. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," he had said, his voice warm and reassuring. "Let me take care of you." It seemed like a lifeline then, a promise of comfort and belonging. She packed her belongings with tears in her eyes, leaving behind the home that held decades of memories. At first, life in David's house was pleasant. His wife, Ellen, welcomed her with open arms, and their 2 young children brought a sense of vitality that Martha hadn't felt in years. But as weeks turned into months, the small courtesies began to fade. Ellen, once so gracious, now assigned her endless chores under the guise of keeping active. The laundry, the dishes, the sweeping, tasks that Martha once performed in her own home with a sense of purpose, became burdensome under Ellen's watchful eye. "Mom, could you pick up the kids from school today?" David asked one afternoon, his tone casual but expectant. Martha nodded without hesitation. She had always been the helper, the one who made life smoother for those she loved. But the errands and requests piled up, leaving her with little time to rest or reflect. Her modest pension, which she had planned to use for small indulgences, was now contributing to household expenses. At first, David had protested, but his resistance waned as financial pressures mounted. Soon he stopped giving her the allowance he once insisted she keep for herself. The Buddha teaches that attachment is the root of suffering, and Martha felt the weight of her own attachment, her belief that her children's homes could replace her own. One evening, after a particularly draining day of babysitting and cleaning, she found herself sitting alone in her room. The light of the full moon spilled through the curtains, illuminating her reflection in the mirror. Her once vibrant face was marked by lines of exhaustion. In that moment, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. She was a guest in her son's house, not its heart. Determined to find a new beginning, Martha moved to her younger son, Michael's home. He and his wife, Clara, lived in a larger house, and they welcomed her with smiles that felt genuine. "You'll be so comfortable here, Mom," Clara assured her. "We've set up the guest room just for you." But comfort was fleeting. Michael, a businessman with lofty ambitions, soon began discussing opportunities with her. "Mom, if you could just help us with some seed money, we could make this family stronger," he said one evening over dinner. Clara chimed in, painting a picture of future prosperity. Martha hesitated. Her savings were finite, but the promise of helping her son succeed tugged at her heartstrings. Over the months, the requests grew bolder. When Martha could no longer provide financial assistance, the tone of the household shifted. Small irritations grew into thinly veiled resentments. Clara's cheerful demeanor turned cold, and Michael became distant. They began suggesting she sell her old home, which had stood empty since James's death. "It's just sitting there, Mom," Michael said, his tone insistent. "You could use the money to make your life easier, and ours too." Martha refused, clinging to the house as her last semblance of independence. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence whispered to her in these moments of despair. Life, ever changing, does not adhere to our desires or expectations. She began to see the truth in her children's actions. not as malicious, but as reflections of their own struggles and limitations. Yet this understanding did not ease the sting of their neglect. Martha's final attempt to find solace came when she stayed with her daughter, Anna. Unlike her brothers, Anna was single and lived a quieter life. Martha hoped this would bring them closer, rekindling the bond they once shared. But even here, peace was elusive. Anna's work as a journalist consumed her days, leaving little time for her mother. Martha often ate meals alone, staring at the empty chair across the table. One winter evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Martha sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The world outside was silent, a blanket of white muffling the chaos she had known. In the stillness, she reflected on the Buddha's teaching of dukkha, the inherent dissatisfaction of life. Her children, for all their shortcomings, were not the source of her suffering. It was her own clinging to an ideal that no longer existed. In that moment, Martha resolved to return to her old home. It would be quiet and lonely, but it would be hers. She would hire a caretaker if needed, use her savings wisely, and find peace in her own company. The next morning, she informed Anna of her decision. "Mom, are you sure?" Anna asked, her voice tinged with guilt. "I just want you to be happy." Martha smiled gently. "Happiness, my dear, is not found in others. It is cultivated within." As Martha packed her bags, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The Buddha's words echoed in her mind. "You cannot find peace by avoiding life." With every step toward her independence, Martha found herself closer to the serenity she had long sought. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the small village where Sarah had recently settled. She stood by the window of her modest apartment, gazing out at the world with a quiet sense of detachment. The simplicity of the scene, a child chasing a ball down the street, an old man walking his dog, brought her an unexpected comfort. Here, in the stillness of her own space, Sarah had begun to piece together a life she thought she had lost. For years, Sarah had been the epitome of selflessness. She had worked tirelessly as a teacher, pouring her energy into shaping young minds while simultaneously raising her own 3 children. Her husband, Robert, had been a kind but distant man, devoted to his career as a civil engineer. When he passed away shortly after their retirement, Sarah found herself unmoored, drifting in a sea of loneliness she didn't know how to navigate. Her children had been her anchor, or so she thought. She had clung to them as her purpose, her reason for carrying on. The decision to move in with her eldest daughter, Mary, was made with hope. Mary's spacious suburban home seemed like a refuge from the silence of Sarah's own house. "You've done so much for us, Mom," Mary had said, her smile warm but her eyes distracted. "Now it's our turn to take care of you." The words felt like a balm on Sarah's weary heart, and she packed her belongings with a sense of cautious optimism. At first, life in Mary's home seemed idyllic. The grandchildren's laughter filled the air, and Sarah reveled in the bustle of family life. She baked cookies, read bedtime stories, and listened with genuine interest to her son-in-law's tales of his work. But over time, cracks began to show. Mary, though loving, was often preoccupied with her demanding job. The responsibilities Sarah had eagerly taken on, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children, became expectations rather than offerings. "Mom, could you watch the kids tonight?" "We have a late meeting," Mary asked one evening. Sarah agreed without hesitation, but the pattern repeated, and soon she found herself managing the household more than she had anticipated. She tried to speak with Mary about feeling overwhelmed, but the conversation ended with a curt, "We're doing our best, Mom. Can't you see how busy we are?" The Buddha teaches that suffering arises from clinging to people, to expectations, to roles we have outgrown. Sarah had clung to the idea that her children could fill the void left by Robert's absence. She had imagined a seamless harmony, a mutual exchange of love and care. But life, as the Buddha reminds us, is impermanent and unpredictable. After a year, Sarah made the difficult decision to move out. Her son Daniel offered her a room in his apartment in the city. Daniel, a graphic designer, lived a fast-paced life that left little room for connection. Though his intentions were good, Sarah often felt invisible in his world of late-night work sessions and take-out dinners. The space they shared was cramped, and Sarah found herself retreating into solitude. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, a memory surfaced. It was of her own mother, who had lived with Sarah in her final years. Sarah recalled the frustration she had felt as a young mother, balancing her own family's needs with her mother's care. Though she had loved her mother dearly, there were moments when she had resented the intrusion, the disruption of her carefully constructed life. The memory stung, but it also brought clarity. Sarah realized that her children's struggles were not born of malice, but of the same human limitations she had once faced. The Buddha's teaching on compassion, metta, resonated deeply within her. True compassion, she realized, extends not only to others, but also to oneself. She had spent her entire life giving, often at the expense of her own well-being. It was time to practice kindness toward herself, to nurture the quiet voice within that whispered of her own needs and dreams. The decision to live alone was not easy. Sarah had spent decades entwined with the lives of her family, and the thought of stepping away filled her with both fear and anticipation. She found a small apartment in a quiet village, using her savings to create a space that felt truly hers. The first few weeks were a strange mixture of liberation and loneliness. The silence was deafening at times, but it also allowed her to hear her own thoughts, unfiltered and raw. In the mornings, she walked along the riverbank, the sound of water lapping against the shore soothing her restless mind. She began to meditate, finding solace in the stillness and the gentle rhythm of her breath. The teachings of the Buddha became her guide, reminding her to let go of the past and embrace the present moment with gratitude. One day, as she sat by the river, an elderly man approached her. He introduced himself as Henry, a retired doctor who had moved to the village years ago. They spoke about their lives, their joys and sorrows, and Sarah felt an unexpected connection. Henry shared a story about a patient who had taught him the value of impermanence. "She told me," he said, his voice soft, "that the most beautiful flowers bloom only for a short time. Their beauty lies in their fleeting nature. Isn't that true of life as well?" Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had spent so much time mourning what she had lost: her husband, her youth, her role as the center of her family. But in that moment, she saw the truth in Henry's words. Life's beauty was in its impermanence, its constant unfolding. As the days turned into months, Sarah began to thrive in her solitude. She discovered a love for painting, capturing the vibrant colors of the world around her. She joined a book club where she found a community of kindred spirits. Slowly, the heaviness in her heart began to lift. The Buddha teaches that the mind, when freed from attachment, becomes like a clear, still pond, reflecting the world as it truly is. Sarah's journey was not without challenges, but each step brought her closer to that stillness, that clarity. She realized that living alone did not mean being lonely. It meant creating a life rooted in authenticity, a life where she could nurture her own spirit while extending love to those around her without expectation. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Sarah sat on her balcony with a cup of tea. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a fleeting masterpiece that filled her with awe. In that moment, she felt a profound peace, a sense of alignment with the universe. She whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not for what she had gained or lost, but for the simple gift of being alive, of experiencing the present moment fully. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she saw a message from Mary. "Thinking of you, Mom. Miss you." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. swelling. She typed a response, her words infused with the love and wisdom she had cultivated. "I miss you too, my dear. Life is precious. Don't forget to cherish every moment." The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the small, bustling town, where Thomas now called home. He stood by the window of his modest house, holding a steaming cup of tea, watching the world awaken. The clinking of shop shutters, the chatter of street vendors, and the distant laughter of children filled the air. To an outsider, his life might seem unremarkable, but to Thomas, it was a symphony of contentment. He had found peace in simplicity, a treasure that no amount of wealth could ever replace. For decades, Thomas had been a man consumed by ambition. As a successful engineer, he had built a career that allowed him to provide generously for his wife and children. He had saved meticulously, always planning for a future that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. But life, as the Buddha teaches, is impermanent, and the future often arrives in ways we least expect. His wife, Eleanor, passed away suddenly after a brief illness, leaving Thomas adrift in a sea of sorrow and unanswered questions. The loss of Eleanor marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Thomas's life. For months, he wandered through the empty halls of their home, haunted by memories of a life now out of reach. His children, scattered across the country, visited sporadically, their lives consumed by their own families and careers. They encouraged him to sell the house, to downsize, to move closer to one of them. But Thomas hesitated, unsure of what he truly wanted or needed. One day, while sorting through Eleanor's belongings, Thomas stumbled upon a small notebook she had kept. Inside, she had written thoughts, reflections, and fragments of wisdom she had encountered over the years. One passage stood out. "Wealth is not what we have, but how we use it. Let it flow like water, nurturing and sustaining, but never let it stagnate. To cling is to suffer." The words resonated deeply with Thomas. For years, he had clung to his wealth as a safety net, a shield against the uncertainties of life. But what good was it now, sitting idle while his days slipped away? The Buddha's teachings on non-attachment and the impermanence of material possessions began to echo in his mind. He realized that his savings were not a treasure to hoard, but a tool to shape the remaining years of his life. With newfound clarity, Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold the large family home, keeping only a small portion of his possessions, and moved to a quaint house in a quieter town. The proceeds from the sale were divided thoughtfully, some to his children, some to charities, and the rest to fund the life he wanted to live. It was not about extravagance, but about living with purpose and intention. In his new home, Thomas began to explore interests he had long neglected. He joined a local art class, where he discovered a love for watercolor painting. He started volunteering at a nearby shelter, finding joy in helping others. Each morning, he walked to the market, greeting familiar faces and savoring the simple pleasure of selecting fresh produce. The rhythm of his days became a meditation, a practice in mindfulness and gratitude. One afternoon, while painting by the river, Thomas met a young woman named Clara. She was a single mother struggling to make ends meet while pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse. Her resilience and determination reminded Thomas of Eleanor, and he found himself drawn to her story. Over time, he became a mentor to Clara, offering her not only financial assistance, but also encouragement and guidance. Thomas's acts of kindness were not grand gestures, but quiet offerings, rooted in the understanding that true wealth lies in the ability to give. He remembered the words of the Buddha: "Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life." By helping Clara, he rekindled his own spirit, finding meaning in the interconnectedness of their lives. As the years passed, Thomas continued to live simply but richly. He traveled to places he had always dreamed of visiting, not as a tourist, but as a seeker of experiences and wisdom. In a small village in Nepal, He spent a week in a monastery, meditating alongside monks and learning the art of letting go. The silence of the mountains, the purity of the air, and the wisdom of the teachings left an indelible mark on his heart. On his return, Thomas wrote a letter to his children, not to lecture or advise, but to share what he had learned. Life, he wrote, is not measured by what we accumulate, but by the connections we make and the love we share. Use what you have wisely, not just for your own benefit, but for the greater good. Let go of the fear of loss, for in giving, we receive. His children, touched by his words, began to see their father in a new light. They visited more often, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to share in the life he had created. Thomas's home became a gathering place, filled with laughter, music, and stories. It was not the wealth he had once guarded that drew them, but the warmth of his presence and the wisdom he so effortlessly exuded. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by his family and friends, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought of Eleanor, whose words had been the catalyst for his transformation, and of the Buddha's teachings that had guided him along the way. He raised a glass and spoke, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "We are all travelers on this fleeting journey called life," he said. "May we walk it with open hearts, unburdened by the weight of what we cannot keep. May we find joy not in possessing, but in sharing, not in clinging, but in letting go. And may we always remember that the greatest riches are those we carry within." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over those gathered. In that moment, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet knowing that he had lived his life not perfectly, but purposefully. The Buddha teaches that liberation comes not from the absence of suffering, but from the wisdom gained through it. Thomas had found his liberation, not in what he had gained, but in what he had given away. The morning light spilled gently through the curtains, casting a warm glow across Margaret's small living room. She sat on the edge of her sofa, her hands folded around a steaming mug of tea, its aroma rising in delicate tendrils. It was a quiet ritual she had come to treasure since moving into her new home, a moment of stillness to greet the day. The world outside seemed to hum with life, yet here within these walls she had carved out a sanctuary of solitude. For much of her life, Margaret had been the axis around which everything revolved. As a wife and mother, she had poured herself into her family with boundless energy. She managed the household with grace, supported her husband through his demanding career, and raised their 2 children with unwavering devotion. Her days had been a flurry of activity: school runs, soccer games, meals on the table at exactly 6. Yet somewhere amidst the chaos, Margaret had lost sight of herself, her dreams quietly buried beneath the weight of responsibility. When her husband passed away unexpectedly, Margaret was left standing in the shadow of her own life. Her children, now adults with families of their own, tried to fill the void. Her daughter Emily suggested Margaret move in with her family. Her son Jonathan called regularly, reminding her that she was welcome in his home anytime. They meant well, but their offers felt like a double-edged sword. Margaret wondered if she would find solace in their company, or if she would become a burden, a reluctant guest in lives already stretched thin. In the months following her husband's death, Margaret wrestled with these questions. She accepted Emily's invitation, moving into the guest room of her daughter's suburban house. At first, the change was comforting. Emily's children brought a welcome burst of energy to Margaret's otherwise quiet days, and the laughter that filled the house reminded her of the life she had once known. But as time wore on, Margaret began to feel the sharp edges of their different rhythms. Emily and her husband had their routines, their unspoken rules, and Margaret found herself treading carefully to avoid disrupting the delicate balance. One evening, as she sat alone in the guest room, Margaret felt a wave of weariness wash over her. The Buddha's teaching on dukkha, the inherent dissatisfaction in life, surfaced in her mind. She realized that no matter how much she loved her family, she could not ignore the discomfort that came with living in someone else's home. She felt like a shadow, present but unseen, her own needs quietly set aside. Determined to reclaim her independence, Margaret moved into a small apartment not far from the town where she had raised her children. The space was modest, but filled with light, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of ownership over her surroundings. She painted the walls in soft, calming hues and filled the shelves with books she had always meant to read. Slowly, the act of creating a home for herself became an act of healing. The days stretched out before her, unhurried and open to possibility. Margaret began to explore interests she had long neglected. She joined a local gardening club where she found joy in tending to the earth, coaxing life from seeds and soil. Her balcony soon bloomed with vibrant flowers, a testament to her newfound sense of purpose. In the evenings, she attended a meditation group, learning to quiet the restless thoughts that had followed her like shadows. One morning, as Margaret watered the plants on her balcony, she noticed her neighbor, a woman named Clara, struggling with a heavy box. Margaret offered to help, and the two struck up a conversation. Clara was a retired librarian, kind and soft-spoken, with a deep love for literature. Over time, their friendship blossomed, rooted in shared interests and the quiet understanding of two women who had weathered life's storms. Through Clara, Margaret discovered a book club that met every Wednesday in a cozy corner of the local library. The discussions were lively and filled with laughter, and Margaret found herself drawn to the stories they read, not just the ones in the books, but the ones each member carried within them. There was Helen, who had traveled the world in her youth, Robert, who wrote poetry that left the room in awe, and Maya, whose vibrant spirit belied the hardships she had faced. As Margaret listened to their stories, she began to see her own life in a new light. The Buddha teaches that suffering is not an enemy to be avoided, but a teacher to be embraced. Margaret realized that her struggles, her losses, and her fears had shaped her, just as the sculptor's chisel shapes stone into art. She saw the beauty in her scars, the wisdom in her journey. One afternoon, while walking along the riverbank, Margaret paused to watch the water flow over smooth stones. The current was steady, unwavering, carrying leaves and twigs in its gentle embrace. She thought of the Buddha's words, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Life, like the river, was ever-changing, its beauty found in its impermanence. Margaret smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. She had spent so many years clinging to what was, fearing the loss of what she loved, that she had forgotten to live fully in the present. In her solitude, Margaret discovered the art of being alone without being lonely. She cherished the quiet mornings spent journaling, the afternoons tending to her plants, and the evenings filled with the hum of conversation at the book club. She found joy in the simple act of preparing a meal for herself, savoring each bite with gratitude. Her life, once defined by others, was now a canvas she painted with her own hands. When Emily called one evening, asking how she was, Margaret's voice was filled with warmth. "I'm happy, dear," she said. "Truly happy." Emily paused, her surprise evident even through the phone. "I miss you, Mom," she admitted. "We all do." Margaret's heart swelled with love, but she remained firm in her resolve. "I miss you too," she said gently. "But this time, this space, it's what I need. It's what we all need." As the seasons changed, Margaret continued to nurture the life she had built. Her days were not without challenges, but she faced them with the resilience of a woman who had learned to weather life's storms. She embraced the Buddha's teaching of anatta, the understanding that the self is not fixed, but fluid, ever-evolving. Margaret was no longer just a wife, a mother, or a widow. She was a woman rediscovering herself, one quiet moment at a time. On a crisp autumn evening, as she sat on her balcony with a cup of tea, Margaret watched the leaves fall gently to the ground. Their vibrant colors were a reminder of life's fleeting beauty, their descent a testament to the inevitability of change. In that moment, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for what she had lost, but for what she had found. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks, her heart full of peace. Life, she realized, was not about holding on, but about letting go. And in that letting go, she had found herself anew. Emma sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as the rain painted streaks across the glass. Outside, the garden she had tended for years glistened, the flowers bending under the weight of the water. The rhythmic sound of the rain was a welcome companion, soothing the ache that had settled in her chest. She glanced at the empty chair across from her and let out a soft sigh. It was not the first time she had felt the weight of solitude, but in this stillness, she had begun to find a clarity she had never known before. Her life had been defined by love and sacrifice. Emma had married young, pouring herself into the role of a wife and mother with an enthusiasm that left little room for herself. She had been the type of mother who stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, and the type of wife who kept the house immaculate to make her husband's life easier. When her children were grown and her husband passed away after a long illness, Emma found herself at a crossroads. She could not shake the feeling that she had given so much of herself that there was nothing left. Her children, Henry and Julia, loved her deeply, but were often consumed by their own lives. Henry lived in another state with his family, his days filled with board meetings and business trips. Julia, a single mother, juggled the demands of her career with raising her son. They called often, their voices tinged with concern, but their visits were infrequent. "You should move in with me, Mom," Julia had said on one such call, her voice laced with guilt. "It'll be easier for both of us." Emma had hesitated. She adored Julia and her grandson, but she knew the toll that living together could take on a relationship. Instead, she chose to stay in the small house she had shared with her husband. It was quiet and lonely at times, but it was hers, a space where she could begin to rebuild her life. The Buddha teaches that clinging to relationships, even the most cherished ones, can lead to suffering. Emma's love for her children was boundless, but she realized she had spent too many years tethered to their needs, her own happiness an afterthought. Now, as she sat in the quiet of her home, she began to understand the importance of compassion, not only for others, but for herself. In the weeks that followed, Emma began to establish a routine. She joined a community yoga class, her stiff joints protesting at first, but gradually giving way to newfound flexibility. She started volunteering at a local shelter, her heart swelling with purpose as she helped prepare meals for those in need. On Sunday afternoons, she would visit the library, where she often lost herself in novels that transported her to distant lands and unfamiliar lives. One day, as she walked through the park on her way home from the library, Emma encountered a young woman sitting on a bench, her face buried in her hands. Concerned, Emma approached and gently asked if she was all right. The woman, whose name was Lila, looked up with tear-filled eyes and confided that she had just lost her job and didn't know how she would provide for her young daughter. Emma listened without judgment, offering words of comfort and encouragement. They parted ways with Lila clutching Emma's number in her hand, a small lifeline in a storm of uncertainty. The encounter stayed with Emma, not because of what she had given, but because of what she had received. The Buddha teaches that true compassion is an act of selflessness, a recognition of the shared humanity that binds us all. Emma realized that in helping Lila, she had opened a door to a deeper understanding of her own capacity for love and resilience. As the months passed, Emma and Lila formed an unlikely friendship. They met weekly for coffee, their conversations ranging from life's challenges to its small joys. Lila's determination to rebuild her life inspired Emma, while Emma's quiet wisdom provided Lila with a sense of stability. Together, they navigated the complexities of their worlds, finding strength in each other's presence. One evening, as Emma sat knitting in her favorite chair, her phone buzzed with a message from Julia. "Thank you, Mom," it read, "for always being there, even when I didn't realize I needed you." Emma's heart swelled, but instead of replying immediately, she placed the phone aside and gazed out the window. She thought about the years she had spent trying to hold her family together, about the sacrifices she had made willingly but not without cost. And then she thought about the present, this moment of stillness, of gratitude, of peace. Emma had learned that love, when given freely and without expectation, is the greatest gift. She no longer measured her worth by what she could do for others, but by the light she carried within herself. The Buddha's teaching of metta, or loving kindness, had become her guiding principle. She extended it to her children, to her friends, to strangers like Lila, and most importantly, to herself. As the rain subsided and the first stars appeared in the night sky, Emma set her knitting aside and rose to light a candle. The flame flickered gently, casting a warm glow that filled the room. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, not for what she had lost, but for what she had gained. The wisdom to let go, the courage to embrace her solitude, and the grace to love without attachment. In that quiet moment, Emma felt a profound sense of connection, to her family, to Lila, to the world, and to herself. The Buddha teaches that liberation comes not from clinging to the past, but from embracing the present with an open heart. And in that embrace, Emma had found her freedom. The gentle sound of wind chimes swayed in the late afternoon breeze, filling John's small veranda with a soothing melody. He sat in a weathered wooden chair, his hands resting on his lap, watching the golden hues of the setting sun stretch across the hills. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where the light met the earth in a seamless embrace, as if nature itself was offering a silent lesson in unity. The years had etched lines on his face and sprinkled silver through his hair, but his eyes remained bright, reflecting the quiet wisdom he had gathered through a lifetime of joys and sorrows. John had always been a man of certainty. A retired professor of philosophy, he had spent decades guiding students through the great questions of existence, teaching them to seek meaning amidst the chaos of life. Yet in the solitude of his later years, John often reflected on how little he truly understood until life forced him to live those lessons himself. The death of his wife, Eleanor, had been his first great loss, and the passing years brought the quiet drift of his 3 children, each consumed by the demands of their own lives. In the beginning, John had struggled with their absence. His once busy home, filled with laughter and lively debates, became a place of silence. He wondered if he had done enough as a father, if he had given too much to his work and not enough to his family. The thoughts gnawed at him, threatening to turn his solitude into despair. Yet, in the stillness of his empty home, John began to uncover the truths he had long taught but seldom practiced. The Buddha teaches that suffering arises not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to what is. John realized he had been clinging to a vision of life that no longer existed, a vision rooted in the past. He began to understand that his children's distance was not a rejection, but a natural unfolding, a testament to the independence he had always encouraged in them. This shift in perspective was not immediate, but gradual, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. Determined to find peace, John decided to simplify his life. He sold the sprawling house where memories of Eleanor lingered like ghosts and moved to a modest cottage at the edge of a quiet village. The decision surprised his children, who questioned his choice. "Dad, don't you want to be closer to us?" his daughter asked during one of her rare visits. John smiled gently and replied, "Proximity isn't measured in miles, my dear, but in the heart." In his new home, John embraced a life of intentional solitude. He spent his mornings tending to a small vegetable garden, his hands finding solace in the soil. Afternoons were reserved for reading and writing, activities that had once been professional obligations, but now felt like acts of pure joy. He wrote letters to his children, not to admonish or advise, but to share the beauty he found in his simple days. Today, he wrote in one such letter, "I watched a sparrow build its nest, each twig placed with care. It reminded me of you, of how you've built your lives with such courage and love." John also began to meditate, a practice he had long admired but never fully committed to. Each morning he sat cross-legged by the window, his breath a steady rhythm that anchored him to the present. Through meditation, John discovered the profound truth of anatta, the Buddha's teaching of non-self. He saw how his identity as a husband, a father, a professor had shaped his life. But he also saw that these roles were not the essence of who he was. He was more than the sum of his titles. He was a being connected to all of existence, a ripple in the vast ocean of life. One day, as John walked through the village market, he noticed an elderly man struggling to carry a heavy basket of fruit. Without hesitation, John offered his help, and together they carried the load to the man's small stall. The man, whose name was Ravi, thanked him profusely and invited him to share a cup of tea. That simple act of kindness sparked a friendship that enriched John's life in unexpected ways. Ravi, a retired musician, shared stories of his travels, his joys and losses, and the two men found solace in their shared understanding of life's impermanence. Through his connection with Ravi, John became more involved in the village community. He began teaching philosophy to a small group of villagers, blending his academic knowledge with the wisdom he had gained through experience. His classes were informal, held under the shade of an old oak tree, and often ended with laughter and lively discussions. John found a renewed sense of purpose in these gatherings, not because he sought recognition, but because he saw how the teachings resonated with others. The Buddha teaches that true happiness arises from letting go, not just of material possessions, but of the need for control, the need to shape life according to our desires. John learned to let go of his expectations, both of himself and of others. He no longer measured his worth by his children's visits or his accomplishments, but by the peace he felt within. One crisp autumn evening, as the village prepared for its annual harvest festival, John stood by the river that bordered his garden. The water flowed steadily, reflecting the soft glow of the moon. He thought of Eleanor, of the life they had built together, and of the lessons her absence had taught him. He thought of his children, scattered across the world, their lives vibrant and full. He felt no sadness, only gratitude, for the love he had known, for the wisdom he had gained, and for the present moment, which was more precious than anything he could imagine. The sound of laughter drew his attention, and he turned to see Ravi approaching with a group of villagers, their arms laden with lanterns for the festival. "John," Ravi called, his voice warm and inviting, "are you coming?" John nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet joy. He joined the group, carrying a lantern that cast a soft, golden light. Together, they walked toward the village square, their footsteps a gentle harmony against the backdrop of the evening. As the lanterns illuminated the night, John felt a profound sense of connection to the people around him, to the earth beneath his feet, and to the boundless mystery of life itself. The Buddha's words echoed in his mind. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. In that moment, John knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, a part of the ever-changing flow of existence, both alone and deeply connected. In his final letter to his children, John wrote, "Life is not a straight path, but a winding journey, full of turns we cannot foresee. Embrace each moment as it comes, and let go of what you cannot hold. In doing so, you will find a freedom that no one can take away." As he signed his name, John felt a deep peace, a knowing that his life, though imperfect, had been deeply, beautifully lived.